Good Monday morning. We're going to continue our lessons on Ruth that we've entitled God Has a Plan Through the Pain. Yesterday we stopped and we took a look at Naomi and all the grief and suffering that she has had to endure. We're going to continue that today. And I'm doing that for two reasons. I thought yesterday some of you may wonder why that we're spending so much time focusing on this grief and all the details of what Naomi went through. But we're doing that because to really understand the magnitude of what we're going to see God do in her life, we've really got to understand the magnitude of the grief and suffering that Naomi went through. Also, we don't want to minimize her grief. We talked about that yesterday too. We're learning from everything we see. We're not just telling a story. We're learning from the story that we are reading. As Christians, we don't ever want to minimize the suffering of another. We want to learn to be compassionate, and we want to learn to be a blessing to those that are going through grief, because at one time or another, all of us will be at that point of grief. And we're going to, in a few days, as we walk this out, we're going to hear Naomi say some things. We're going to see her do some things. But the most devastating thing to me is the things that we're going to see her think. And sometimes when we're going through grief and suffering, and the devil comes in and he makes us think some things about our God that are not true. He makes us feel isolated from God. Many things that we're going to see as we walk out her story. So in order to really appreciate why she thinks those things, and to have compassion for her even when we see her say and do some of the things we're going to see her say and do, we got to lay this strong foundation. I felt like this morning as I was thinking about her and I was getting ready to video, I thought, God, I feel like I'm almost pleading her case to help you understand the grief that Naomi has gone through. Can I encourage you this morning too, since we're talking about these things, and we talked yesterday about how people grieve different. Well, people react to every situation different. One of the things that has really bothered me through this pandemic that we're going through is I have had people that I've talked to, and I have seen a side to people that I hadn't seen before. My nephew said that this coronavirus was causing everybody's personalities to rise to the top. And I was really struggling with that a little bit. And then I had a dear friend to say to me, Karen, don't forget that sometimes fear causes people to react in anger instead of weeping or instead of a desperation. And that really did help me. And we have to understand that people react to grief. They react to different situations different. So let's be a gracious, kind people to one another. We're all going through this together. We all react different, but we all as Christians need to be a compassionate, kind people. Yesterday, we looked at the first thing that had happened in Naomi's life. Bethlehem, where she lived, was experiencing a famine, and her husband Elimelech had taken her and her two sons to the land of Moab. And we talked yesterday about the fact that even though that famine was hard, she still had her family. But that's not where it ended. Let's look at verse 3. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. Now we see the next stage of Naomi's pain, and this was not just the pain of being taken from her home. This was a grief that comes from the loss of her husband, her mate, her provider, her protector, her lover, her friend. I don't know the words to say to describe her grief, but I know that there are many of you sitting before me today that maybe has lost a husband or a wife, and you would be able to give me in vivid detail the grief that you feel when you lose a mate. The famine was hard, I grant you that. But the famine was nothing like the experience that she was having now with the loss of her husband. Not only was she having grief and pain, I'm sure there had to be a fear associated with this. We have to remember the culture in which Naomi lived. There was no Social Security. There was no welfare. There was nothing to help her. Plus, she was not living in her homeland with her relatives who would have came along beside of her and helped her. She's in a strange land, and she has faced the loss now of her husband. And I'm sure there has to be some fear there, but she still had her 2 sons. But there's still more to come. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And they had lived there about 10 years. This hasn't been an overnight thing. She hasn't just been there a couple of months. Her sons have married 2 Moabite women, and they have lived there now about 10 years. And then listen to the next verse. And both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. The next stage of grief we see is the loss of her 2 sons, and how devastating that must have been. She did not just lose one of them, she lost both of them. The scriptures simply do not tell us how they died. But when I looked up their names in the Hebrew, both of their names were derived from words that meant sickness or consumption. So I don't know if they had been sick for a long time. I really don't know the reason that she lost them both, but she has lost them both. So now she has left her homeland. She has been in Moab 10 years. She has lost her husband, and she has lost her 2 sons. I'm sure that even when she lost her husband, as devastating as that was, she still had her 2 sons. She still had a family. She still had someone to get up and talk to. She still had someone to cook for. She still had someone that would be there to help protect her and provide for her. But now she loses them both, and again, I'm at a loss to describe how she must have felt. In life, I think all of us, in the back of our minds, we realize there could be a possibility that we could lose our mates, but it's just not a natural chain of events in life for a parent to have to lose their children. And I'm speaking to some people today that have had to give up their children, and I cannot even imagine what loss that must have been for her. Not only has she lost her husband and children, but she is isolated in a strange land from her people with her 2 daughter-in-laws. Let's go just a little bit further. Ruth 1, beginning with verse 6. When she heard in Moab the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughter-in-law prepared to return home from there. Daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. And with her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living, and she set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. And may the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." And then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." Naomi hears that the famine is over, and so she sets back out down the road to take her back to her homeland, and her 2 daughter-in-laws are with her. But at some point, she tells them, "Go back to your families." And it says that they kissed her and wept aloud and told her they did not want to leave her. And I want to stop and look at this just a minute, because we haven't said anything about these 2 daughter-in-laws, and we've just talked about Naomi and her grief, but she's not the only one grieving in this story. Orpah and Ruth, they had married into this family. I'm sure they loved their husbands. I'm sure just as Naomi, they had hopes of children, as Naomi had hopes of grandchildren. So when death comes, it is not just a grief of losing someone now. Death can take away your hope and the future that you have planned out for your life with someone else. And so they are all suffering here. They are weeping. I'm sure they loved Ruth and they loved Elimelech. They had married into this family. So Naomi's not the only one that's lost her hopes. Ruth and Orpah has lost their hopes too. So I want to end today this story that has not seemed encouraging at all, but I want you to understand these last 2 days that I've talked to you about all of this grief has been very, very necessary for us to understand. And I want you to understand too that we can relate it to our lives today because we're learning from this. All of this grief, all of this death, all of this weeping, all of this sorrow, all of this fear, all of this uncertainty, all of this separation, all of this unknown that we're talking about in their lives, we can have that in our lives too. And we think, how can anything at all good come from all of this that's happening? All of this pain and suffering that we see as it relates to us today, we can look around now and think, how can anything good come from the things that we are seeing? We talked about this yesterday. Some of us during this COVID-19 crisis have not experienced the amount of grief that other people have, but we've all experienced uncertainty. We don't know what's facing us in the future with all of this. And so we have to ask ourselves and remember what Naomi and them did not know, but what we're going to learn and what we're going to see. The reason that we can have hope, the reason that we still have a future is because our God has a plan through the pain. We can't see it now. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the days to come. But we've got to hang on to the fact that God has a plan. Just as we're going to watch it walk out in Naomi's life and in Ruth's life, we're going to realize that it's going to walk out the same way in our lives. Our God is not away from us at this time. He knows the future. We don't. We have to trust Him, depend on Him, because our God has a plan through the pain. Pray with me this morning. God, I thank you for your word this morning. God, I ask that you would use this word to encourage your people. I know as we have had to look at the stages of grief and weeping and suffering, it may not seem like an encouraging message, but what makes it an encouraging message is because we know that no matter what we go through, our God is still in control. God, you are still in control of our lives. You're still in control of this world. You are a sovereign, almighty God. You made it all. You control it all. And God, you have a plan through the pain. God, we are a compassionate people today. We want to be. And so we do pray for those that are grieving today. I pray for those that are listening to me today that I just talked about losing a mate or losing children. That may be a very fresh grief for someone that I'm speaking to today. I pray for them that you would draw close and comfort them. I pray that you would drop in their heart this title of this message, that you've got a plan through all of this pain, that you've not left them, you've not forsaken them. You're going to go with us through anything that we go through, and you're going to help us, and you're going to make good come from it. And we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. We will be back here in the morning, and we will continue walking out this story with Ruth and Naomi together. See you in the morning.